the previous edition of George Washington Speaks, we learned about George Washington's mission to Fort Le Boeuf, which included Christopher Gist, Jacob Van Braam, and their porters and Indian guides. They trekked over 500 miles to encounter the French and to deliver a demand from the governor of Virginia for the French to give up their claims to the Ohio Valley. It's important to note that when we speak of the British during the French and Indian War, that we're talking about the 13 British colonies, since they were still united with Britain. Also, Washington's journey to Fort Le Boeuf was on behalf of Virginia only, not Pennsylvania or the other 11 colonies. When he returned from the trip to Fort Le Boeuf, young Washington wrote and published a diary of his trip. His story was daring and exciting to readers in both the colonies and England, and the name George Washington began to become known. The tensions between the English colonies and the French did not improve after Washington's trek to Fort Le Boeuf. The following spring, the French were moving many more troops into the area to build new forts, to establish its presence, and to prepare for a clash with the British. At the same time, Virginia Governor Dinwiddie called upon a more confident Washington to make some moves against the French efforts. Let's listen to George Washington as he opens this next edition of George Washington Speaks.
I felt it was my duty to my family, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and to the Crown to accept the next assignment from Governor Dinwiddie. It was to turn back the French challenge and to lay claim to the Ohio Valley for England. I raised 150 troops in Virginia and was given my first battle command. We set out in May, and just over 3 weeks later we reached a wide open area in the forest that was called the Great Meadows. It was 60 miles from the French soldiers and their Indian allies at Fort Duquesne. Upon our arrival at the Great Meadows, our Indian scouts discovered a small force of French and Indians just a few miles away. We immediately set out to build a small stockade for our protection, which was named Fort Necessity. Later, our Indian guides determined that the French contingent was only a scouting party and that they were hiding in a rocky ravine. I decided we should move closer to them, watch their movements, and determine their intentions.
Young Washington was beginning to develop a desire for battle and look for a command in a wartime situation. Although we approached the French contingent in the ravine cautiously, they saw us approaching and immediately went for their weapons and began firing on us. We returned their fire, and due to our superior force, the French surrendered within 15 minutes. The battle was short and decisive. The French leader, Jumonville, perished, as did 10 others in his party. The 21 survivors were taken prisoner. Young Washington had gained his first battle experience and his first victory. He performed well despite his youth. Upon returning to Fort Necessity, we waited nearly a month for reinforcements from Virginia to arrive. During that time, the men were instructed to cut a 20-mile road through the forest toward the French Fort Duquesne. We were preparing for an even bigger fight that we felt was on the horizon.
As the men were felling trees and building a crude road in the direction of the French stronghold, we were unaware of the large gathering of French troops at Fort Duquesne. Our contingent had grown to 400 able-bodied men and Indian scouts from numerous tribes, and I continued to prepare for my mission of attacking and capturing Fort Duquesne. We had advanced the road for 13 miles from Fort Necessity when our scouts discovered that General de Villiers and a large number of his French troops and Indians were approaching us from Fort Duquesne. I thought it prudent to fall back to the safety of our small fort for the sake of the men. Well, we barely got back to Fort Necessity when we soon were surrounded by a force of more than 1,200 Frenchmen and Indians. They quickly took positions in the hills overlooking the fields surrounding Necessity and began to fire on us. At the very same time, heavy rains began to fall and continued without slowing down all day long. The Indian devils even climbed the surrounding trees to lay their terror on my men with their musket balls. The rain made the meadow ground so wet that the trenches we dug outside the stockade, where the men could lay and fire out from a position where they weren't so exposed, the trenches filled up with water. And the men were laying in them, but we had them abandon them to come back into the fort.
The French had the fort surrounded, and we were outnumbered nearly 3-1. It was an impossible situation. Colonel Washington was nearly killed twice during the battle, but both times I was able to intercede and protect him from direct fire. We suffered a full day of enemy musket fire, and the rain got our powder supplies so wet that we couldn't fire our muskets. At the same time, the number of wounded and killed continued to mount. At the end of the day, the French general, under a flag of truce, stated that he'd allow us to surrender. After discussing the terms of surrender with the other officers, Washington decided to accept the offer. I might note that traditionally the terms of surrender are offered by the victor in their language. In this case, it would be French. Washington's translator, Jacob Van Braam, may not have had the language skills he described of himself. The impact of his lack of language skills, which will be discussed in a few minutes. Young Washington, who weeks before was fortunate that his first fight had been a victory, was now faced with the exact opposite situation, his first defeat and his first surrender. I observed that he placed the lives of his men over the duty of his mission, which was a difficult decision for a young leader with ambition and with limited experience. Despite the pressures of command and Washington's devotion to king and country, he made the decision to surrender to the French to preserve the lives of his men. I had served under Washington's elder brother Lawrence, and the sense of duty I saw in the elder Washington was also evident in the young lieutenant colonel.
The French general gave us the option to surrender, which I accepted to preserve the lives of my troops. I must also mention that Christopher Gist, the same man who had accompanied me to Fort Le Boeuf, not only proved again to be a worthy tracker and knowledgeable in the ways of the natives, but a brave soul who twice at Fort Necessity placed his own life at risk to protect mine. For him, I will always be grateful. The surrender to the French was a defeat on many levels. Not only did I fail in my mission to the British Crown, but I also failed as a leader of men and as a gentleman. I struggled with the decision, but I took time and deep contemplation and prayer, which helped me to arrive at the conclusion to surrender. The French proved to be gracious, allowing us to keep our pack animals and provisions for the journey back to Virginia. But defeat is not something that settled well with me, and it forced me to consider my role as a military leader and as a man. It wasn't until later in my life that I was finally able to put that defeat behind me.
Washington made his way back to Virginia, and although he had suffered a defeat, he was celebrated by the Virginia House of Burgesses for his bravery against major odds. Historians continue to debate Washington's role in escalating the tensions between the French and the British, and whether Washington's decision to attack the French at their encampment was justified or not. From the French perspective, Washington and his troops attacked without provocation. As support, they offered the documents of surrender that Washington signed, and which included his admission that he was responsible for the assassination of the French general. Others cite that the documents of surrender were poorly translated from French to English, and that Washington didn't know what he was actually signing. Washington himself said that he would never have knowingly signed the surrender if he had known that he was admitting to assassination. What is clear from the Battle of Fort Necessity, that Washington was gaining experience and recognition, even at the age of 22, as a formidable leader. Secondly, as we'll see in the next edition, that the role of the Indians in the French and Indian War was critical to the ultimate success of the colonists. Let's take a look at some discussion themes from this segment of George Washington Speaks. Young George Washington received the strength to make it through the battle and surrender to the French because of his faith. How does faith help people make difficult decisions or endure difficult times? What did you learn in the video about how Christopher Gist was able to guide George Washington in making difficult decisions under difficult conditions? Who in your life serves to guide you, and how? The colonies learned to work together and cooperate in the early battles with the French. Why is it important to cooperate with others to address problems? And can you give an example of that in your own life? The skirmishes between the French and British colonists were due to the desire for expansion into the fur trading areas and control of the rivers for navigation. Can you think of other instances in history in which economic disputes led to wars and conflicts? The defeat of Washington could have been considered a blemish on his military career, but actually served to prepare him to become a wiser leader in later years. Faced with the same challenge of protecting the lives of one's troops through the surrender versus attempting to continue to battle against insurmountable odds, how would you rationalize your decision either way? The French and Indian War was the first time that the individual British colonies banded together for a common cause. How did that help set the stage for the colonies to band together against the British 2 decades later? Washington's faith played a major role in his early development and helped him with difficult situations later in life. How does faith inform our decisions today? And what lessons can we learn from Washington?